So, moving right into chapter 11, we'll finish chapter 11 probably on Thursday. We'll start chapter 12 on understanding channel relationships on Thursday as well. We will cap it off on Tuesday, and that will ready us for the test. Last day will be next Tuesday. Okay, so we've tackled power. We've got an understanding of power, what its nature is, and why it isn't necessarily bad. Power is one of those things as a tool that can be used as a good thing. Well, very well, by the same nature, so can conflict. So, what is conflict? Conflict basically comes from the Latin word confligere, which means to collide. Usually, it has mostly negative connotations. It's usually thought of something that you wish to avoid and consider something of a struggle. We look at the definition of conflict as a state of opposition or discord among members. And in channel conflict, we mean that as the behavior behind or by a channel member in opposition to the wishes or the behavior of their counterparts. But once again, like we talk about power as being a neutral thing, we also have to look at conflict as a neutral thing as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Conflict changes things. It forces us to look in a different way. Some of the most helpful people can be a royal pain, but if they force you to consider other possibilities, then it's not necessarily a bad thing and it can lead to enormous good. So just remember also this is that it's different from competition because conflict is between individual groups, whereas competition is struggling with the nature of everything that in it. You don't directly attack each other with competition. You're both trying to seize something, a third party, when you're in competition with another group. So just remember, it's not necessarily bad. It is different from competition. It definitely arises when two groups have one or two opinions that are different from each other, but then welcome to the world. That's what the world is. Doesn't mean it has to be bad. Use conflict as a tool if you know how to do it in a proper way. So, conflict is not the same in terms of a feeling. And so this kind of gives you a interesting description or a drawing of what conflict is. And unfortunately, they got part of this wrong. Because if you want to use this as a reasonable statement about stages, it should go from latent to perceived to felt to manifest. And that's the proper way of doing it. I don't know why they did that. Must have borrowed that diagram from someone else. So we talk about the types of conflicts. You might consider them stages, but one doesn't necessarily lead to another. And they can be separate. And as a matter of fact, there are several in here that I would call good. So the first one to look at is what's known as latent conflict. And this basically happens when there's sort of inevitability where both groups are pursuing their own separate goals. They know that each other group exists. If they ignored each other, it would disappear. But it happens just for the natural time when channel members are trying to kind of retain autonomy when they're working together, when a manufacturer is talking to a supplier and you both have your own particular turf that you need to be able to protect. That's latent conflict, all right? Sometimes it's not even understood. You may understand it's there, but once again, if you just ignore it, it's gone completely. And so that's latent conflict. Perceived conflict is a cognitive, emotionless recognition of a contentious situation. This is an understanding that there is an opposition or a difference of viewpoint, but it is simply an understanding that that's the way the world works. It's all in a day's work. There's no difficulty with conflict being in that situation. It is simply managed and it is moved on. Felt or affective conflict, AFF, by the way, is an emotive state, not effect. So affect basically is where members start to personalize their differences with each other. They start to see economic considerations start to come into the front. You have negative emotions and anxiety and frustration, hostility. As I said before, you start to see the conflict directed towards individuals and even become like personalities in themselves. You know, that group over there, you just can't get anything done with them. They're arguing all the time. I've never been able to get a decent day out of them. It just doesn't make sense. That's kind of the emotion. And as I said before, it becomes personal to us as well. Manifest is the last step, and you could probably say it is the worst because this is when it is expressed through behaviors, when they're actively trying to even sabotage each other and doing not only those things, but simply withdrawing them from even considerations when they're looking for other places to ship from. So, I mean, these are the types of conflicts you could look at latent and perceived as being the general state of conflict that you would call that you would find conflict that keeps you motivated. Felt is when things become difficult, and then finally manifest is basically when it is full out. It is the worst that it can possibly be. Functional conflict, where you're willing to work together, can happen all the way to felt. Manifest, unfortunately, is too far down the line. So we talked about measuring power. There's also a way to measure conflict to determine whether or not your organization is in a particular conflicted way. And once again, we have one of those formulas that conflict equals the importance of something multiplied by the frequency of disagreements and then the intensity of those disputes. If we break down those three things, then we start to get an idea. So you start counting the number of issues, but then conflict comes the importance, how many, and the intensity. It does kind of help you to break it down because you can look at and see those particular constructs and know how important they are. But it's also important to understand that's a mathematical formula, right? So if I were to do this for real, I would put this on a 0 to 10 scale, each one of those. So how important is it? All the way up to 10 as being super important. Disagreement to frequency, if it's up to 10 where it just seems like it never stops. And then the intensity of the individual disputes, that once again, as well as a 0 to 10 scale. What happens when you multiply a number by 0? Right, exactly. So think of it this way, okay? Any one of these things, if it doesn't mean anything, then you don't have conflict, okay? And you might have something extremely important, and there might be a lot of disagreements, but if there's no intensity in it, it's just yabber yabber, it doesn't make a difference, okay? That's how you understand conflict. And we can think of people in our lives that just constantly go on, and it's like, give me a break. But it's, you know, it's all hat and no cattle, they're just talking the talk. And if you look at individuals in that way, it can make it a lot easier for you to be able to deal with it. So the great thing about this formula, when you look at it, is that it captures everything that you need to know about conflict in the relationship. How important is it? You know, how frequent? What is the intensity? And it finally comes into the where and why. Sometimes you can find that if you diagram it in this way, you can find where the hole is and where there is no conflict. And so one of the things that we have to do is talk about the good side and the bad side. So I think I mentioned, let's see. Here we go, Morgan and Hunt Commitment Trust. That's that article that you don't have to know, that you might get bonus points if you do. This is where you find that particular magic little button called functional conflict, which says that there's a positive when it is communication and when it is shared values. These positively relate to trust and ultimately help functional conflict. And why do you want functional conflict to grow? Is because functional conflict is the good conflict. So functional conflict basically recognizes each other's contribution. It understands that success depends on others and that we can oppose each other. We can have different opinions without damaging the arrangement that we have between each organization. And if you remember when I just showed you that Morgan Hunt, one of the things that they said is positively related to functional conflict was communication. Communication and cooperation among channel members is the golden ticket for making conflict a functional and good thing. You can discover where you have differences. Maybe perhaps even dig up and find where even the original roots of the problems were. It may prod your partners to achieve more, to get better results, to basically stir up things and hopefully be able to work through your differences, be able to communicate with each other frequently and push each other to perform better, all right? Because the truth is, if you're not complaining at all, you worry, are you really caring at all? I mean, sometimes the lack of opposition doesn't mean that there isn't any opposition. It just means lack of caring. And if someone, or at least if there's conflict that is related into the business relationship, there's a chance, just a chance, that they really want to be successful. And they may have a better idea on how to do things, but sometimes it takes bumping heads to be able to get those ideas out. And so conflict can be good, functional conflict. And then conflict can be bad. The good conflict is functional in that it helps you to improve your functions. The bad is manifest, because manifest is basically taking everything and it creates cost, lowers value. You start to think that there are better alternatives out there for your particular work. It increases tensions. It becomes part of what's known as organizational memory, which means that it is a mythos that is carried from one individual in the organization to the next, as long as there is interactivity between those particular organizations. And it isn't hard for people to rub elbows and just get ticked off with each other. And so, unfortunately, manifest conflict sometimes takes years to emerge, but it destroys trust because there is no honesty in dealing with each other, and eventually it's just going to collapse by itself. Conflict is costly, and the final thing is that it doesn't have to be minimized. And we are all in situations where we think if everything just damps down a little bit, maybe everything will go away. Sometimes the harder and the better aspect is to bring them up and see if there's any any way of being able to agree with each other, hopefully find a second way. And if not, then at least you will have given your very best. And sometimes that can just be enough. The worst thing, though, you must drive out the emotion in that, and that's the most difficult at all. So where does conflict come from? Where does conflict come from in the interaction between channel members? So we're going to talk about these one at a time. We talked about goal incongruence a lot. We've talked about how the manufacturers at the top, the intermediaries in the middle, and the end users at the bottom are actually split because the manufacturers and the end users want the same thing, more product. And the intermediaries want to be able to manage process and relationships with consumers. The ultimate goal here is more sales. And the ultimate goal here is more profit. They sound different. I mean, they sound the same, but they're not different. I mean, they're very different. Sales just means selling. It's just simply selling every unit that the manufacturer produces, because that's how they produce their money. The intermediaries are more worried about the process and the relationships, because ultimately they make their money on profit by adding value to whatever products that they sell. And so the goals are the first. The second is the individual perceptions of reality. We'll talk about agency theory and how that works in. And then where is their turf? What is theirs and what is no one else's? And this especially happens at the intermediary stage. We talked about the difficulty of having more than one channel. This isn't necessarily a bad thing when when it is right sized to the product categories that they have. And then also the difficulties with dual distribution. Channel redundancy, or number of partners, can be acceptable. However, when it rolls into competition, when you have simply too many individuals on the same channel layer, that's where things get difficult and you start to see competition among the existing customer base. What you hope for is enough channels to cover all of the market segments that you wish to pursue. And so I want to show you the first thought. I'm not sure if you've ever seen agency theory. If you get into industrial organizational psychology, this is going to be one of the big things that we talk about, why people do things in organizations. So we have a theory, popular, that is called agency theory. Come on, come over. Let's see. It's me. There we go. Okay. So one of the big theories in industrial organizational psychology is what's known as the agency theory. The agency theory hopes to illuminate the differences or the different interactions between people in the office environment and how they go about doing their jobs. So, agency's theory basically states that there are two groups. Two groups are two individual groups that work together, and they are the principal and the agent. The principal would be the manager who hires you to do a particular job. The agent would be you, who is supposed to be tasked to do that particular job. Let's say you're running a projector at a theater. That would be an example. So the principal might be the manager or the owner who hires you. They hire you to be able to perform a given function. And so what we have is the principal lines up the tasks that you're supposed to perform. The agent performs the task basically given to them by the principal. And then that is what is returned back to the principal, the performance, what they're doing. However, what agency theory says is that each one of these individuals have their own self-interest and own reasons and purposes for doing what they're doing right now. And so the principal, the individual who gives the job out, they may be wanting to promote their particular theater. They may need to do broader things than that. They may be needing to manage contracts between the studios, those kind of things where they get the films. The agent's primary job is to make sure that it plays on time. That's it. That's what it should be. However, the agent also has their own personal interests about doing things as well. That also means is that they have their own list of things that they have to do at the beginning or the ending of whatever they're doing. And so in the pursuit of their own self-interest, they might accidentally come into conflict with each other through no appropriate reason other than simply going through their lives. And so what the agency theory helps you to do is kind of understand the competing goals between individuals who work together. So if we look at the manufacturer and their purposes, the tasks that they give to the intermediaries, they ultimately have the task of giving to the end user. The difficulty, of course, to the manufacturer is, why do I need this individual to carry this out when I might be able to carry these things out myself? And so this is the first brick in the wall that can cause difficulties, is that we all have our own reasons for pursuing the things that we wish to do, and sometimes we just don't understand each other. See, there's no real clash here. It's just you've got different purposes and reasons for doing what you wish, and sometimes it's just not understanding. And you don't really have to understand, just go along. The other is different perceptions of reality. Because we also are in this particular condition, we live our lives for different other people. We have a different focus for each one of us in the way that we do our work, then we can come up with different responses for the same situation. We all have our different focuses. Upstream, we focus on the products and the process. Downstream, we focus on the functions and our customers, and it just sometimes is a whole ball of wax. Now, having said that, international markets can be much worse because basically we just have different ways of communicating than others. Especially Western Europeans can seem to Americans sometimes to be brusque, but that is their basic way that they have in working and dealing in their situations, all right? Western culture in the United States tends to smooth a lot more, be a lot easier on individuals, whereas in Western Europe, that's not necessarily so. Eastern European is a little bit more westernized, but they've been hammered, for 70 years. So there's a difference in the way that they perceive their realities too. Asian cultures as well, it's perfectly acceptable. It's important for you, if you're going to travel, is to understand that everyone has different and unique responses. And if we can just find our way to find some commonality, that all comes through better communication and better sensitivity. Ultimately, it can lead us to some really lasting friendships and good long-term connections. So differing perceptions of reality. This also happens with intra-channel communication. Generally, upstream members, if I am a downstream partner and I am wanting to be able to represent as many possible products to make sure that I have enough customers, my upstream partners can take offense. If I am a Best Buy and I'm a category killer, I want to have as large an assortment as possible to be able to exploit the economies of scale. It doesn't mean that it's going to create a conflict, but it is a place where you can certainly have it. From the downstream perspective, the upstream manufacturers, if they're looking for new outlets, the inherent worry is, what's wrong with me? I can carry everything. And it may not be that way at all. This is kind of a little bit of the whole part of different perceptions of reality as well. But we all have our own perspective about the way things work and the way things are driven. It gets worse the more routes we have. So the managing of multiple channels also becomes difficult as well. If I have suppliers who are using a traditional outlet, if I'm also finding that my competition is using newer routes, they may be more efficient, and that may spur conflict with the manufacturers who prefer to go to another supplier who does their work in a more efficient manner. And once again, here we are, the suppliers don't really care, because the suppliers basically have a greater chance of getting their goods out. The customers are going to find a better way or easy way to find things. I was just looking up, I was going through the things and thinking about Walmart. I did not realize how Walmart has just dove into selling MacBooks. I was shocked because it hasn't been that long ago that there was an exclusive contract, especially through the Apple stores. Seems like Walmart's walking all over that. And they wouldn't be able to do that without the help of Apple. So I just found that to be interesting. So this is a very busy slide. I just want you to think about this in the same way that we've talked about it before. Multiple partners to the suppliers, when they're in the same market, it will naturally create conflict. And so, as long as there are product categories that include shopping, it's an inevitability. So, are there any ways in which you can be able to handle this? Well, the one way you can hope is that you're in a growing market and the expansion is going to be natural. Another way, if you perceive that products are differentiated, that'll be a way as well. And here's the part that did surprise me, is one of the ways is that you can just limit the number of lines that you can find at a particular location. Best Buy does not sell Apple MacBooks. That surprised me as a category killer. But Walmart does, and that's even more surprising. It's some kind of conflagration. Basically, it just comes down to is that they find they find Walmart to be an easier conduit for selling those things than Best Buy, which amazes me. How do they manage the conflict? They basically manage it by putting them in places where the sellers don't necessarily seem to be in direct competition. Best Buy is not necessarily in competition with Walmart, but by the very same token, Walmart is not in competition with an Apple store at a university. So I had to change things when I was looking over this because I was surprised at what they've done. So just because there are multiple channels, they don't naturally auto compete. So I've said this before, one of the interesting things is that every soft drink in the United States was actually manufactured in the South, which is kind of funny. Coke was, of course, in Georgia. Barks was in New Orleans and Biloxi. RC was here in North Carolina. Cherry wine was. Mountain Dew was in Tennessee. Anyway, all of those basically started in the South. Around the 30s, you started to see the first example of vending machines. You could actually buy just one. The first bottling actually happened in Vicksburg, Mississippi, that made them like a shopping item. They used to only be in fountains or places where you could get a drink at a drugstore. Anyway, they started bottling them, putting them in stores, and then all of a sudden, vending machines started coming out in front of supermarkets, and the supermarkets started going ape because they were saying, why are you selling your single bottles of Coke outside when I want them to come inside and buy your Coke? And what it took Coke to do, took them a while, is to get consumers convinced that the people who were outside buying the Coke were not the same people buying them inside for the same reason. Both groups had different reasons. And so multiple channels do not necessarily compete when they achieve a different value. The value of shopping the goods in store is a substantial discount in price. Shopping the vendors outside in the bottle or the drink machine is that the drink is cold and available at that moment. And so sometimes, but not necessary. So we're not going to worry about this other than this whole part here when I talked about how do you manage multiple channels. Just remember I said one of the reasons how is that you can set different product lines for different competitors. And that's one of the ways that you can manage it. For years, Walmart just only sold the iPads and they sold the iPhones. Now they've gotten bigger. And we're rolling up onto one of the more difficult subjects that causes conflict, and it's a victimless crime. And it is there for the world to see, and nobody wants to do anything about it, and it's called the gray market. So I've told this story before. When I worked in Lafayette, the school there, Fatima, wanted to always buy from my store regardless. And so when it even came to buying their Commodore 64s for their lab, they came through us and we were not authorized dealers. But we had a authorized dealer in Houston who would sell 10 of us at a minimum, give us about a 25% discount because they were a wholesaler, ship them to us. We put 10% on it and sell it to Fatima. And that's exactly what a gray market is. A gray market is a sale of authorized, branded products through unauthorized distribution channels. This is not, these are not knockoffs or copies. They are the real thing, but different people are selling. So they are not what are called arbitrageurs. So what an arbitrage is, to give you an example. So this is a very bad drawing off the coast of China, and this is a very bad drawing of Taiwan. There are lines of iPhones that are sold that are made in China that are not available for the Chinese market. However, there are corporations off the mainland who will sell substantial numbers to Taiwan, and they in turn will ship them back for like a little cut of the money. And this is how authorized branded products go through unauthorized distribution channels. There is no real victim other than the supplier themselves. And the supplier, for the very truth of it, doesn't care, because what's the number one thing that a supplier wants to do? What's the one thing a supplier wants to do? It's the major source of conflict. If they're making more, what do they want to do? Sell more, okay? It's as simple as that. So the supplier comes in, he has an order for 20,000 iPhones. Yeah, I'll sell them. They're coming back. I just sold them. You know, that's the end of the deal. You know, the stuff in the middle, I don't care. I've just sold 20,000 of an item. And so, as I've said, the victim might be the supplier, but the victim is getting what they want. So it's not much of a particular crime. So, what causes gray markets? Well, one of the ways is that if you have channel members or partners that have substantially different pricing. And sometimes that can just be through contracts. When I was in Lafayette, when I worked at Con Appliances, I think I've said this one, when we were selling Mitsubishi televisions, there was New Generation that was just right outside the Lafayette city limits, but their contract with Mitsubishi was Mitsubishi Canada, which was a totally different organization than mine. And so they actually got their TVs shipped from Canada at a significant discount that we couldn't match. And so that's one of the sources of gray markets. The other is that there's different prices in geography. So has anybody ever seen Smokey and the Bandit? Yeah, I figured not. Anyway, the whole plot of Smokey and the Bandit was you could not buy Coors beer east of the Mississippi River. Okay, believe it or not, there was such a time. Why? Because Coors is cold filtered and always cold stored, and at that point there was no infrastructure that could ship cold beer across the United States unless you got a crazy trucker who could do it in 8 hours, you know, going 1,000 miles. And that's what the whole story of Smokey and the Bandit is. Now I've spoiled it for you. But there's more. You can watch it. Anyway, you know, it was the #1 movie in the world for a year. I swear to you. Look it up. Okay. Crazy world we live in. So anyway, differential pricing in different places does those things. It doesn't matter, you know, you ship these with Louis Vuitton, Chanel, you do these things, you bring the goods back to Japan, you sell, but there's no sin. Because the whole point is that consumers are desiring those products and they want to get them at whatever reasonable price it is. And so that's why we call gray markets, even though they're a source of conflict, it's a victimless crime. Everybody gets what they want. The manufacturer sells what they want because all they care about is selling profit. Okay, the downstream members, they get to sell things and make more money. the channel members that might protest it's unfair, but they supply the markets at the same time. And enforcement is not easy because everybody gets something for it. And so there's always a spank about it every once in a while, and people get upset, but nobody's gonna do everything. Everybody likes it stuff, okay? So you don't, you just have to realize it is the nature of the beast and it'll never go away. I think, let's see. Want to be able, let me just talk about reducing the negative effects. And then I think we'll be finished for the day. The one thing that we want to be able to do is find a way of negotiating through some of the negative effects, okay? Remember, we want to be able to manage and not minimize. And the difficulty with trying to manage conflict is that conflict can create more. It's extremely difficult to overcome. Once it gets into organizational memory, parties just simply stop talking to each other. So with all of that, as difficult as it is, there are reasons why you should do something about it, all right? The first one is you do not threat. It sounds silly. No, don't threaten anybody. But the truth is that the expectation is, oh yes, if I just tell them the right way to do it and then put a little sauce on it, it'll make it easier for them to understand. No. Threats are always perceived as coercion. They will only make things worse, okay? It can achieve positive purposes, but it's not in this way, especially when it is increased conflict. You might actually have a few groups doing real things, including sanctions against you, and that's not going to solve the problem. What you hope to be able to do is balance. The first is to understand that each group has a reason and purpose for being there. You want to be able to balance the power between both of them. One of them is by recognizing the value that they bring. And then find strategies in which they can both increase their production together. And so, in other words, you try to give the carrot versus the stick, give out promotions and rewards for achieving certain goals, making sure also that those rewards also are consistent across the line so no one group is perceived as being treated unfairly. And so you have to be able to show some form of balance. And ultimately just realizes that most organizations, what you will find them doing is passively accepting it. Acceptance is how most organizations deal with too much conflict. The best thing is to be able to create a constructive discussion with your supplier using active voice, which we'll talk about on Thursday. But usually you're stuck between two things. You accept, argue, which makes no good, or you find some way of creating a common ground. We'll talk about on Thursday also the ability of mediation and arbitration and how these are able to provide some balance as well. I'm going to stop here because I want to use this to lead into talking about procedural and distributed fairness. This will also lead us to mediation and arbitration, and then talk about how we normalize it in organizations and make conflict better. Okay, we're done. I will see you on Thursday. We'll finish this up and we will start beginning our relationships. Have a good day.